on the YouTube, that's when I know we're live. So we
We're
just
live.
keep quiet because we don't want noise. Okay, we're live. Welcome to episode 3 of 11 Named People, the show that is inspired by something Eric Hobsbawm wrote once. I'm John Jacobs, and I'm with, you can say your name,
Oh, Tony Karon.
Tony Karon, and we're hosting the show. It's basically, I mean, we're not going to say this every time, but this show, apart from being inspired by Hobsbawm, it's just basically a continuation of something we did when we taught a class at the New School for a couple of years called Global Soccer, Global Politics. At one point, we even pretended we were going to talk about sports in general, but everybody knew if they came to that class, all we talked about was football. So to start us off, so I think what we want to do, starting tonight, the way we're going to do the program is we'll do a couple of quick takes at the beginning, what we call, is it called the curtain raiser?
Yeah.
Or what do you call the fight that's happening before the big
undercard?
Fight?
The undercard in boxing, yeah.
We'll start with the undercard, which is just 2 quick takes on 2 different things. And then we'll get into tonight's program. You'll quickly figure out tonight's program is a lot about, it's a lot about racism within football and sports. So that's going to be sort of a theme running through things. But I don't want to give too much away, except I want to quickly give a shout out to the African Women's Cup of Nations, which I mentioned before in a previous episode. The final is on July 23rd. That's on Saturday. And it's between South Africa, Banyana, the girls. I don't know what's the thing with repeating yourself, Bafana, Banyana. And the other they will play against Morocco, which is a big surprise. Morocco qualified for the first World Cup, as I said the last time. South Africa for the second World Cup because the semifinalists go to the World Cup. The other one is the game for the third and fourth place will happen on Friday, the 22nd. That's between Nigeria and Zambia. And my last plug for this is go to YouTube, search for the African Women's Cup of Nations, and look at the highlights. The football is really great. The game between South Africa and Morocco's game and Nigeria. That's an incredible match to watch. It rivals some of the football that I've seen in the Euros that just happened. But I think Tony wants to say something about that.
Yeah, just to add my little note of mourning, which was the departure of Spain. Of course, Sean and I are never fans of England, but that really wasn't the point. That Spanish team was just absolutely exceptional. They play a brand of football that was the football that won the Spanish men the World Cup in 2010. And it was gorgeous to watch. Like Aitana Bonmati running that midfield like Xavi in his prime. She is absolutely exceptional. And you know that when they get their 2 goal scorers back from their ACL knee injuries, there'll be a force at that next World Cup where hopefully South Africa will be represented as well. But Sean, you have some answer. You've got something to answer for this week. Like, rumor has it that you went to see the Top Gun movie. So why are you
Top Gun Maverick? I think is that the title? Top Gun Maverick.
I think so. But now, why are you going to see Cold War imperialist propaganda?
I was upstate. It was raining. There was nothing you could do. This is in upstate New York, just to locate myself. And my wife and I, we said, okay, we needed something. There was nothing showing in any cinema. So we went to like a nearby town. And the one movie that if you didn't want to see the Minions, which I understand is a phenomenon because of TikTok, we went to see Top Gun. And I then, before I went, I saw that given the nature of our show, and I wasn't being that deliberate, I don't want to make excuses. A.O. Scott, who reviews films for the New York Times, he said that at heart it was a sports movie decked out in battle gear, but a bunch of guys showboating, trash talking, and trying to outdo one another. The problem is it's a very, very bad film. And beyond that, it is just an effective military recruitment video for the US, but it is unclear a recruitment video for what, for fighting who.
That's my question. Who was the enemy? Who was the enemy in this film?
You never see them. So just quickly on that, it's an unnamed. They don't even say it's a country. They just said the enemy is constructing a uranium plant, like sort of deep in some mountain. I don't want to give all this like silly plot away. And then they have to train to go take out this uranium plant. And finally, when they get there, they're basically facing people you never see. Their faces behind the equipment that they're wearing, you know, like the face mask and the helmet, you cannot see the enemy. There's no insignia on their planes, but you could see that it's the United States fighting this unnamed enemy. And I think you have a suspicion of who you think the enemy might be in this film.
So I'll share this in the comments, but I did write something a while back about Red Dawn. Okay, so Red Dawn in the 1980s was one of my favorite movies to get a little sort of goofed, as we used to say, in an anti-imperialist cloud, and have a good laugh at, because it was the most ridiculous idea that there would be a Soviet invasion of the United States. But if you thought that was ridiculous, even more ridiculous was the sequel, because what happens in the sequel is they make this movie about China invading the United States. And then the Hollywood studios are like, whoa, wait a minute. We can't antagonize China as one of our biggest growth markets. So they have to go and spend millions and millions of dollars of digitally remastering that, to take all the Chinese insignia off, change all of the script and so on, and they make it a North Korean invasion of the United States, which is even more absurd. But now, when you tell me this time they just don't have an enemy, it's just a smudge, well, that's a sign that even though they're making Cold War propaganda against China, Hollywood needs the Chinese market so much. That's a brilliant encapsulation of the world we live in now, where basically the global capitalist economy, China is the industrial capitalist center of it. You can't antagonize them, even though you're going to make Cold War propaganda.
It's just a terrible film with like really kind of pretty people.
I would have gone to see Minions. I've been loving that series.
In hindsight, I should have gone and seen Minions. I think in hindsight it would have been better. I would have been better off if I'd seen Minions. And I also didn't get what even the jousting, the trash talking it's sort of quite. I don't want to use the word camp, but I don't want it to be misconstrued. I say it was camp. It's just like not very good. It's over the top, and if they at least had fun at their own expense, it would have been okay. But there's nothing ironic. There's no commentary on nothing. It's just a terrible film. And Tom Cruise, like I remember, I'm talking about sports movies. Jerry Maguire, it was called Jerry Maguire, which is him and Cuba Gooding, who won an Oscar for this film, about this football player who needs like a last contract. He hires this agent, who's played by Tom Cruise. Even in that film, I felt that Tom Cruise, there was just like, in South Africa, like they'll say like "fatagit," like is there like something you can touch like there? And it's just he's an empty. It felt empty, and in this film, it's even worse. It's just like there's nothing to add about this. Yeah.
Okay, good.
We should talk about what we want to talk about. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talk about the important stuff. So, Marcus Rashford. I mean, tonight we have a series of stories that all tell aspects of the issue of racism in our game, and how it's dealt with, and more.
Or in some cases, in sports.
In sports in general, but also and how it's not dealt with. And there's a fascinating encounter that was on HBO, actually, on LeBron James' show, where Marcus Rashford, the Manchester United midfield, and he's been, I don't know if it was an OBE, he got some sort of recognition from the British Crown for really important charity work he was doing in terms of highlighting the need to keep school feeding going during COVID. So, he's a person with a social conscience, and, he's doing good, ambassador for the game and so on. But it's really interesting, the sort of tiptoeing around the question of racism when it comes to, say, what he and other Black England players have faced when
things it is worthwhile. It's worthwhile setting it up, though. So the show is called The Shop, and it's sort of part of LeBron James's, transformation from just being like an athlete to being this kind of an athlete who has something to say. So he created like his own show with some of the people who run his businesses. This guy called Maverick Carter was part of it. And then they invite sort of like a mix of people from sports, sometimes an actor. And this episode, which was like last weekend, they had Rashford, Daniel Kalua, is that how you say his name?
Kalua, yeah.
So his parents came from Uganda to England. LeBron and Rashid Johnson, I think his name, an American artist. But anyway, so how did they get to Rashford? And then I'd like to hear what you, because I know you have opinions about this one. They basically started by asking LeBron what plays does he hate, where he hates playing. So, and he said Boston. Now, if you this was a lot in the media. If you you watch a lot of ESPN clips or you watch ESPN, that's all they talked about. LeBron thinks that Boston is racist. And so, some players who played in Boston, they had to defend that. And that's when they said to Rashford, what is it like to play football in England? And Rashford sort of generally talked about kind of how the opponent's fans can often be racist. But then one of the I think Maverick Carter said, well, there's something else happened. You were playing, you had this great summer, you played for England, and they all sort of said, yeah, you guys went to the final, this was wonderful. But then your own fans turned on you. So that was the cue, was your own fans turned on you, to which Rashford responded and said, well, they said, do you think it would be different if you guys were white? And
the players who missed the penalties.
Yeah, the players who missed the penalties were white. And Rashford said, yeah, it would be. So he acknowledged that there was racism, but then he did a bunch of other things. And we have a clip. Maybe we should show the clip quickly, and then we can talk about it. So here's the clip. Okay, hold on.
Yeah. So it's like it happens, but they just want you to win. Like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, bro, it's toxic, my guy.
Yeah, it is toxic.
No, that's like.
Yeah, but
I felt for you, man. Like,
I felt for you too.
Because it's just sitting there, you're like. And that's why you get conflicted with supporting England. It just reminds you of being a kid in England. It reminds you all them times where you're out, everyone, and then someone says something. So you're black, or someone's parents said something. Like, usually what fucks you up is adults say something to you as a 4-year-old, as a 5-year-old. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And then it reminds you of that where you're trying to get closer to the identity of being English, and then that happens. Like, oh yeah. There's this guy. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's like, because, like you said, there's feelings.
I feel like they just react.
Like you said, there's feelings, like people are pissed off and this is that and the other, but you instantly go there. So why'd you go there? That means it's just there waiting. It was just that kind of, it was a jolt of a reminder of like, oh yeah, this country. It's why I was never comfortable in a pub like that.
Yeah. Of course.
You know what I mean? As a kid or when I'm young, it's like why I can't go certain places. Like, it was that. What happened with you lot, that's what it was.
You still feel that way after even winning an Oscar? You don't feel that's put you in rare air, a different space? You still have
black, bro. Nah, bro. Like, if I believe in that, that's when I'm in trouble, I feel. Because it's like, then you think that it's disappeared. You believe what this is going to exchange. Like, it's nothing to do with what we've achieved.
Right.
It's like, it's nothing to do with, like, the reason why they're doing it is nothing to do because we've underachieved. It's like, the reason why they're doing it, because they've got something wrong with them. Police stop me there. They don't know I got an Oscar. That's I'm carrying it out the window. Like you said.
There you go.
Yeah. So that piece is so interesting because Rashford is kind of making excuses to some extent for the England for the England fans. And he's basically saying, yeah, well, they just, they really want to win and they were upset without winning. And Daniel Kalia basically corrects him and was like, no, this is racism. and it's there. And the fact that the players, that the response to losing and missing a penalty is a racist attack tells you, what's unresolved, what is, and
I mean, yeah. I also
yeah,
think it has something to do with how in Britain or in European football, I don't think you can totally do what you can have the total comfort that, say, an American sports person could have. I'm thinking just about the West. I mean, I don't want to talk about the developing world because I think in some places it's still worse to be politically engaged like that. Like in Brazil, for example, I understand there are exceptions where players are politically, like they talk openly about racism, they talk openly about class inequality. I think there was like Juninho, the player who played in France. I think he played in Nice or something. He was one of the few players, and maybe Romario, but in general, players tend to be play it safe, repeat right-wing talking points. And I assume that in European football, it's still deemed not. Maybe that's where Rashford's sort of tentative response came from, because it took a while. Like it was only last year that you see Raheem Sterling talk about racism and people were okay with it. And for Rashford, Rashford could talk about food, food schemes, but not. There was nothing in what he said about that topic ever that was about, say, the racial inequalities about that. It was very much a sort of straight up, just I'm going to talk about it as a class problem.
Yeah.
I think that maybe I'm not trying to make excuses for Rashford, but I have a sense that there's a little bit of
this
that.
Isn't about, I don't think this is about personally should Rashford do this or should Rashford do that, but I think what it sort of gets to is that I think in the UK and definitely in Europe, and we'll see that when we come to the Bakayoko story, there's this idea, there's like an exalted space in which Europeans, Brits, whatever, tell themselves that they've resolved the issue of racism. That, like, look, there's an England team that has 6 black players on it. I'm old enough to remember when Viv Anderson was the first black player in an England shirt. And look how far we've come, kind of idea.
Well, they did that
when things go wrong.
2006 or 2010, where there were a number of black British figures sort of talking about how differently they view the English national team. That they were sort of, then there were these ads. Remember the famous Umbro ad?
Yeah.
Where they all sing "God Save the Queen."
But the rest of it doesn't.
They were supposed to be, the shift was supposed to happen, and as we know with the Euros last summer, it turns out it didn't.
And also, the same thing we remember with France. It's like France wins the World Cup with a team that has Arab players and black players, and it's like, oh, Beur, Black, Blanc, and we're all, this is great, it's the new France, whatever. And things start to go wrong for that team. In South Africa, it's the black and Arab players that get blamed. It's just like that quick. And I think
Anelka, yeah, you talk about Anelka, yeah.
Exactly. And so I think, Rashford is tiptoeing around something. It's not saying it's as you said, the system is set up. Rashford is cool with everybody around him if he's being a social justice advocate in terms of broadly, you need to feed the poor. But when it comes to issue of race, it's like, no, we all take a knee. And, we could almost unpack that. Like taking a knee when Kaepernick did it was a radical gesture. He was taking a knee during the national anthem. He was making a point about delegitimizing the national symbol that gives police the right to kill black people and not face consequences because they have that American flag on their shirts. And that's what he's challenging. And sitting, everybody else is standing and he's going down on a knee. It became like a gesture of sort of a branding gesture in a way. Like, okay, everybody take a knee, kickoff starts. It's like, it has lost some of its.
The slight difference is, I think, like the Daniel Kaluuya response tells you that there is a shift in the way that these debates are taking place. Like, what was the phrase he used? He said something like, "No." It was triggering. I can't remember what's the words he used. He's sort of like saying, it's
toxic. He said it's toxic.
Yeah, it's toxic. He was like, I don't have energy anymore for all that.
Yeah.
We've got to move on. And actually, later in the program, of course, his response to that is to appeal for, or maybe he did it earlier. This is Daniel Kalua. It's he's appealing for a sort of black solidarity politics across.
Come on, Daniel Kalua is chairman of Fred Hampton.
Yeah, he's doing that thing where you sort of say, well, if racism in Britain and America is so extreme, then my only option is to go for a kind of black, not nationalist politics, but he also makes the point it's like something that's organic, that evolves, that is made up in struggle, the words we use in South Africa, it actually comes out of struggle. Now I don't know if that's the politics that I would necessarily push, but I could see what he was trying to say is, look, I don't have energy anymore for having to make excuses and say, well, it was like when Beckham got screamed at, or people hated Beckham. No. This is different. This is about belonging. This is about not being seen as part of something. And I don't think I want to spend my energy trying to belong anymore. I think that was part of it.
I mean, he's basically saying the Umbro ad, and we should put a link to it, doesn't work. It's not a reality. It's like, at the end of the day, in your eyes, the England fans, we are not properly English.
Right. Which brings us to which we wanted to just move to the next one, which is, do you want to intro?
And I think it's very related in a way.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to just intro, or should we just show?
Yeah, so we're talking about, and we have a clip to show you to set it up. But the AC Milan midfielder Tiémoué Bakayoko, you may remember, he used to play for Chelsea. He is stopped by cops, by 3 armed, or I don't know if there might have been more, in a very violent and dramatic incident. He's pulled out of the car, he's manhandled, guns are pointed right in his face. And then
something happens. So why don't we show?
Yeah, show what happens, and we can discuss, because.
So let's go. I'm gonna go now. Shout out! That's from Tony's workplace.
My day job. So I think what's what's a really interesting discussion around that piece, and I think you also have a clip, I don't know if we need to show it, where Bakayoko himself talks about this, is what you see happening in that encounter is, at some point the cops realize, and you see his face goes like that, the black man that he's manhandling at gunpoint is an AC Milan star, and that changes everything. And Bakayoko himself goes, what if I wasn't a footballer? What would have happened in that scenario? And obviously we all know, we can see exactly that everything changes the moment the cop realizes who he is. In other words, he's not a dangerous black man in the cop's eyes. He's one of the Rossoneri, like one of the AC Milan players, and that changes everything. And, I think that really tells you something about racism and white racism among fans, and how it creates a deracinated space for black stars that are somehow deemed not actually black somehow, because they are part of your team, right? And Spike Lee actually nails this in 1990 or 1989. Do the Right Thing. There is a fantastic moment of conversation where Mookie challenges Pino, Sal's son Pino, about this very thing. I mean, if you can pull it up, it so nails this issue.
I'm going to show it now, so let's do it. Here we go. Hold up.
I talk to you for a second. Hey, who's your favorite basketball player? Magic Johnson. Who's your favorite movie star? Eddie Murphy. Who's your favorite rock star? Prince. You're Prince. Bruce. Prince. Bruce. You know, all you ever talk about is nigga this and nigga that. And all your favorite people are so-called niggas. It's different. Magic, Eddie, Prince are not niggas. I mean, they're not black. I mean, let me explain this. They're not really black. I mean, they're black, they're not really black. They're more than black. It's different. It's different? Yeah, to me, it's different. You know, deep down inside, I think you wish you were black. Can I talk to you for a second?
I'll stop it there. I mean,
Yeah.
I apologize if anybody is.
Who's your favorite basketball
Oops, sorry,
player?
oops. I gotta
Magic
remove
Johnson.
it.
Who's your favorite movie star? Who's your favorite rock star?
We knew with this.
Prince.
We knew with the new technology and getting the it's our first time throwing some video in, as you can see. So we're gonna get better. But yeah, and we also apologize for the gratuitous throwing around of the N word. Yeah, but it was part of the story.
It's part, yeah, and he's talking about, he's investigating racism, and he's actually showing how this racist character actually makes a special place in his head for people who, in his mind, because they're sports stars, musicians, movie stars, are not really black in his mind. But all of the things that construct his racism, all of the sense of threat or whatever that is, just goes out the window. It's like, no, but that's not really black. And then you see the cop doing exactly that with Bakayoko. That it doesn't mean because there's a happy ending in that what happened.
I think that's definitely what the Italian police and a lot of the comments, if you kind of like translate them, because Twitter has a translation built into the browser. There's like a translation function, and it's very clear that they were like, well, nothing bad happened. So what is the racism? What is the racism? Yeah.
And as Bakayoko himself said afterwards, and as we can obviously see, the real question of racism is what would have happened if he wasn't Tiémoué Bakayoko.
Yeah. No, it's very. I mean, it when it came out, I have to say, I didn't expect it to happen anymore. Not that I'm not being naive about that police don't stop people and that racist incidents don't happen, but I think it's that part of I was less sort of course, I thought about like, what if it wasn't Bakayoko, but I thought more about this other part, this kind of recognition by that moment when he recognizes that he had messed up. For me, that was quite interesting to watch on his face when the guy tells him, "Oh, it's not just another black person." Like in that construction, like what you just showed with Spike Lee. It's actually kind of, if you want, like somebody who works for us. I don't know if that makes sense. It's not he's one of us. It's like, I think in that place.
But you see this a lot in
being employed, for the good of those fans. And if that cop is most likely if he's an AC Milan fan.
But that cop as an AC Milan fan will still shout, or I don't know, I mean, it's hard to say we know anything about what that cop does, right? But it's still possible that fans who have that sense, that way of separating things out in that way, will racially abuse players from the other team, right? That's so common in Italy. And they will even, you remember they wrote a letter to, the Inter Milan fans wrote a letter to Romelu Lukaku, basically saying, don't get annoyed with us when we racially abuse opposition teams or when they racially abuse you, because that's just being loyal to your team. Oh, like just sort of, Benny used to say that, Benny McCarthy from our hometown, Cape Town, used to say, he was playing at Porto, and it might have been when he was at La Coruña Deportivo, but that
he was at what's the ones with the light blue shirts? God,
anyway.
Yeah, he played. But anyway, I'll look it up.
But the point being that, like,
Celta Vigo,
right? And his fans would be booing black players or like racially abusing black players on the other team, and he'd be, "Hey, I'm black. What is the matter with you people?" And they'd be like, "No, you're not black. You're Benny." That's what
people, Which gets me to like the other example that I thought from the last couple of days that I actually was looking at was this was about Richard Williams, who's the father of the Williams sisters. So there is if you remember, there was King Richard, which was the film that is now infamous because Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. I saw Dave Chappelle went to talk to Will Smith. Dave Chappelle's in trouble for his sort of transphobic comments. But
Dave Chappelle's not in trouble. He's stoking it because this is how
he makes his money.
He's making money out of doing this.
Yeah. Well, I was sort of like trying to frame it as like how he plays out in the mainstream. Like they don't understand that Dave is just trolling.
Yeah,
but the thing about it is King Richard was sort of overshadowed by the slap. But the film itself, and I've watched King Richard. I don't know if you did. It's actually well made, but its key thesis at the time was this sort of idea of this, like the way Will Smith portrayed it. Was this kind of like the strong black man, very kind of the critique of racism or the response to racism is to honor or to push for like. I don't want to say a savior, but the figure that's going to fight and take on racism is this sort of black masculine figure. I mean,
and a champion.
Yeah, that's a politics. That is a politics in the United States, in the many politics around racism. That is one of them. This the kind of the idea of, and a lot of so there were this actually happened. A number of white critics, mostly. Understand white women, complained and said like, why is this film about Richard Williams and not about his daughters, Serena, and which is also kind of ignorant, because if you know the story of the Williams sisters, then you know that Richard Williams, you cannot, there's no Williams sisters if there's no Richard Williams. His wife at the time, I think they later got divorced. How do you say it? Oracine. They trained the daughters together, but it's obvious that he had a bigger role. Like his role was much bigger. He had a plan, like he had this crazy idea that he wrote like this 78-page plan, I think, in which he said they were going to be like, they're going to make millions of dollars. He looked like a crazy man because he was training them on a municipal court in Compton, California, like a sort of black working class neighborhood. So, that's in the film. But the key part of that film was really kind of like black man against the world, strong black man against the world. And Will Smith, if you remember, after he slapped Chris Rock, he got his prize, gave another speech, and went on about like how it is the duty of the black man, the black father, to defend his family. So he clearly like framed it in that way. And that, as I said, if you spend enough time around hip hop, which I sometimes do which I still do. I'm an aging hip hop fan on podcasts, etc. That is a thread that runs through it. So a new documentary just came out, and I'll show you how it links to like some of the things we were talking about. It's called On the Line: The Richard Williams Story. It's not out yet. I managed to get hold of a screener. Maybe this will count as a review to the publicity people who gave me a screener. It's a really excellent documentary. It gives Richard Williams like the chance to tell his story for the first time, or in his own words. So it's a documentary film. It's not the sort of like Will Smith portraying him and giving a particular spin on it. It's his incredible life story, which I'll have 3 more sentences before I talk too long, just to set this up. is that it's this idea of like this sharecropper's kid. I mean, he grew up, he's a single mom, grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, like, you know, racist. I think he's about almost 80 now. He's not doing so well, but he's about 80. So obviously 1940s, 1950s as a kid in the South, you know, where it's overt racism and, you know, so he was aware, he grew up in that environment, who then moves to Los Angeles, where he raises like a working class family. I think he works as a janitor, security guard, so on. Teaches himself tennis, and this is the key part. He takes on an institution like a sports institution, which is very white, very expensive, associated with country clubs, and kind of like with the average American at that time was in tennis, most likely voted Republican. You know, a very racist, kind of insular country club type of sport, very expensive. And with some, he meets this guy, I forget his name now, but he's Rick Macy, who's like was a very famous coach. He sort of convinces this guy to train his two daughters. And then Macy only wants to train Venus, but Richard Williams believes that both his daughters are brilliant. And then he starts training them himself. And that's how they become number one, to the point where Serena is probably the greatest tennis player of all time, or probably one of the greatest sports people of all time. You know, she's won the most majors in what they call the open era and so on. But the long story short is like, what's interesting about the film is the film bookends like his life with like sort of there's like two incidences, or two things. One is this like very strong influence of this upbringing where he was in Louisiana, and the you know, the racism that he faced and how he reacted to that. And on the other, the famous incident, I don't know if you remember this, at Indian Wells in the early 2000s. So the Williams sisters goes to play there, and then they play each other in the semifinal, I think. And one of them, and people had accused the Williamses of like rigging games between the two sisters, like that the father would rig the games so that one of the sisters would win and not the other. I mean, there was no evidence for this. They just didn't like the guy. It's a black guy, you know, he's winning, so they couldn't stand it. And these two daughters were incredible. Long story short, they play at this tournament. It's in the desert, Palm Springs kind of area, and the Venus declares that she's injured and can't play. So Serena gets a bye and goes to the final. And I forget her opponent's name, but the crowd, the opponent, Kim Clijsters, is Belgian. And the crowd is literally screaming for Clijsters to win and are booing Serena. So the subtext is Serena fights back, eventually wins the game, and then they vow never to go back to Indian Wells again. You know, they're like, we're not playing there again. And what happened is, up to that point, Indian Wells was an important tournament. After that, it wasn't anymore because the Williamses were bigger than that. But part of this is this thing where he says, this was extraordinary. You have an American crowd booing, and even the commentators note this at the live event, notices this, an American crowd booing an American tennis player. And to make one other quick point, there's also the other big thing in this film is the sort of thesis of it is how American capitalism is racist towards black people. And so what the film does, the film's complaint, like many of the interlocutors, the people in the film, they're upset by this. Why isn't American capitalism like more accepting of, like why doesn't American capitalism, and you're like, why? But then you realize that this is part of sort of American politics or American culture, is to believe inherently in the goodness of capitalism. So there's something about that. I think in a lot of, I'm not saying this is the case with Rashford, or even sometimes how Bakayoko, because Bakayoko, when you see him respond to it, he's also very conciliatory about it. I think there is an element of wanting to believe that capitalism, as you know, we can get a little left wing up in here. Is it like, but in this film explicitly, there is this idea that this sort of feeling sad that capitalism cannot accommodate them and is racist towards them. I was quite surprised that is still a subtext in these debates about racism.
Yeah, I mean that, obviously everything we know about the history of capitalism in general and capitalism in the United States in particular, sort of, there's absolutely no shock in the idea that capitalism in the United States is inherently racist. I think also that the problematic narrative that that you're highlighting is also relevant. Like if you're talking about, when we talk about what happened to Tiémoué Bakayoko, when we talk about, if you talk about the Williams sisters, and I think it was Serena, when, she nearly died, like she was in a situation during childbirth where there was a medical crisis and, the doctors were not believing her about what she was experiencing, and, things worked out. But, in every one of those cases, the issue isn't the exception that that transcends what American capitalism or capitalism in Europe has reserved for most Black people, i.e. that, yes, one or two exceptional people are going to transcend something because of like exceptional talents. That doesn't really address the issue of racism at all. That really doesn't address the issue of capitalism and of the injustices of it at all. It really just reminds us that actually all of those, and I'm sure the Williams sisters would agree, all of those women who are not Williams sisters and don't have their abilities deserve exactly the same justice and recognition as the Williams sisters do. Similarly, every Black person in Milan, whether they're an architecture student from Ghana or a trader from Senegal, deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, not be granted an exception because they play for AC Milan.
But the problem is, like, that is the politics. Sadly, that's the best that people hope for. I think that's still the best that people hope for, that they should be granted some kind of exception rather than we should take on the whole thing. This kind of, like, I think this is where that tentative thing of Rashford for me comes from, or even like I was saying, like, one of the things that sort of, I don't want to use the word triggered because I wasn't necessarily triggered, but I was disappointed. I was just disappointed by sort of a lineup of guests in this documentary sort of being, I'm trying to find the right word. They were just upset.
Yeah, I mean,
exasperated that how could you still treat us like this? Capitalism, you should let us in, because there isn't this inherent belief that's
when we come to football, I mean, you can always see, like, tying it up to what we were talking about last week, the Barcelona Academy. So for every one player from Africa or anywhere else in the world, actually, doesn't even from Europe, even from right next door to the stadium, who enters an academy, for every one that makes it into the first team, 100 or more don't. 100 or more are cast away. So the idea that, like, transcendent ability in some way answers the issue, the questions of structural racism and inequality is obviously a fallacy. It's one that we're sort of invited to believe because, look, our society celebrates. We put Didier Drogba on the cover of Time magazine. That doesn't really tell you very much about what our society has to offer the majority of Ivoirians.
Yeah,
etc.
Yeah, it stays at that. In any case, we wanted to end with someone who, because it was the anniversary of his birth, so it was like he's not around anymore, but it would have been his birthday this week. I still say birthday, right? It's his birthday. His birthday.
Are we gonna sing?
Nelson Mandela. It was his birthday.
Mandela. No,
I don't think anybody's singing. Nobody wants to sing for Mandela anymore. Well, because people in some places. But anyway, I would still sing for Mandela. So anyway, it was Mandela's birthday. But as we also know, Mandela is also associated, was in his life, right? He was associated with sports. I mean, I'm putting up a photograph, which is this famous photograph of the 1996 African Cup of Nations, which is sort of the culmination of that kind of this idea of Mandela being associated with sport. Before that, right, he was associated with boxing when he was young. Then he, of course, while he was in prison, he became, I wouldn't say like a patron saint, but movements that were interested in boycotting South African sport, like racist South African sport, kind of made him, made him part of these campaigns or used him as part of it. And then, of course, there's famously the 1995 Rugby World Cup, in which he, for particularly whites, a large segment of the white population in South Africa, and I would say by extension also in the rest of the world, he was seen to have transcended race. And it's interesting, like that, I was looking around today, and I'd like to hear your sort of thoughts on this, that image of Nelson Mandela kind of stuck. It's still around, this idea of Nelson Mandela as this figure who transcends race, who kind of is bigger than himself. And like, of course, he actually helped make that mythology or this idea about himself grow. Like he appeared at various, what is that big Swiss thing where they hand out awards to sports people and like expensive watches? I think it's called the Laureus Awards. We can fix this in the comments, in the description of the show. The other one is, he did this during the when South Africa was awarded the World Cup, before they were awarded the 2010 World Cup. Even before that, when they weren't awarded the Olympics, he always talks about sports as the ability of sport to kind of bring people together. That was kind of that was like a stick that was associated with him. And of course, the 95 World Cup, I think, I don't want to use the word, it didn't help in puncturing that. It just added to that mythology. I mean, I don't want to say what some of the things that he himself knew about the limitations of that kind of argument, but it's interesting that argument kind of sticks. And I think when I make that point about, it's not as like sort of, this is about capitalism necessarily for Nelson Mandela and holding the sort of capitalist world order. I think it's just a kind of a way of understanding sport and trying to make sense of your place in the world. He kind of contributed to this idea that sport is that one space that can overcome these kind of things that we talked about.
I mean, with the 1995 Rugby World Cup, I read that much more as Mandela as a political strategist, and realizing that basically the apartheid regime was never defeated. It was militarily far superior to the ANC. It chose to surrender or to give way to a process that would result in democratic rule at a point where it was ahead of at least the military political contest. And it was in response to sanctions, particularly financial sanctions, and the idea of just, things were going to would ruin and be ruined for them. And you can argue historically they actually made a very wise choice, because the interests represented by the old apartheid regime of first and foremost white monopoly capital, if we want to use a phrase that the EFF loves to use, they did very well. They did extremely well out of the transition that they accepted at that point. But at that stage, also, the ANC didn't have a lot of cards. Like, I've heard a lot of sort of mythological stuff being thrown out there, that it was a prime political task for the ANC at that point to demobilize white military resistance to a transition, which was a considerable threat. The SADF was very much intact. Its leadership was not sure which way it was going to go. They could, just like that, have decided, forget it, de Klerk, we're not doing this, we're doing that, and that was it. And we didn't, it wasn't like the liberation movement had anything to respond with. So this idea that you start giving sort of white South Africa these little bonsalas, like little, we'll give you a little treat. You can have the Rugby World Cup. because of the liberation struggle, you were not able to play in World Rugby, which is your passion, for decades. Now that you've accepted democracy, you can play in the Rugby World Cup, and I will wear your shirt and celebrate. I mean, I just think that's politics. And it's smart politics.
I mean, as we know, like subsequent to that World Cup, Mandela himself, he took the rugby union, which was run at that time by a guy called Louis Late, who was very infamous for organizing. I mean, you just smiled when I said his name. He kind of organized, like, I think he's the one who organized the famous rugby when after South Africa played in New Zealand in '81, and then they ended up coming through the US. Remember that infamous tour when they played in the US at the end of the '81 tour? After New Zealand, they dropped in the US, and he helped organize that. And people were just trying to, like, protesters were turning up. So this guy, he insisted that people sing the stem, which is the anthem of apartheid, which, as we know, also got tagged onto the poster.
It's ridiculous.
It's one of the most ridiculous things ever. Yeah, I can't believe that that's still happening.
Our national anthem now, South Africa's national anthem, is 2 songs stitched together with no connection.
And there are people who somehow defend this as this is part of the political compromise and this sort of idea of a new South Africa. I mean, it just does not make any sense. But my point I'm just trying to make, even Nelson Mandela he was confronted with his own kind of mythology about the way that sports was operating in South Africa, when he basically said to the rugby union, "You're moving too slow with your so-called transformation," because remember, there was one black player, Chester Williams, who played in the 1995 Rugby World Cup team. I don't even think he played in the final. I think he was on the bench. And like 2-3 years later, nothing had actually changed at the top end of the setup in rugby in South Africa. So for that, Nelson Mandela took them to court. So Mandela himself kind of was like, "Hold up, this is not what I'd given up I'd given up so much, when I was, part of negotiations. I'm going to appear at the game. I'm going to wear the jersey. And this is my sort of showing kind of my sign of political inclusiveness." And even he, in the end, had to recognize that actually it's not necessarily.
If only that was the worst of the failures, sadly. But
yeah.
Tell me, I'm now putting on my Liverpool hat. Is it true, Sean?
Oh, there's a story.
Was Madiba a Liverpool fan?
I mean, so where did that story start? And then I want to hear from you, because this is the thing we want to close with. So in '95, Liverpool came to play when, these preseason tours that are happening now, like all the preseason tours, as we know, are being played in Asia. It's very cynical. It's about eyeballs and shirts, like getting people to watch and getting people to buy things. And then the other option is you come to the US, which is a similar thing. It's also about eyeballs and shirts and people flying for games to Anfield or wherever. I plead guilty. But in any case, in the early 90s, it was interesting. There was when this kind of the mass form of this tour started. They often they would go anywhere. They used to go to South America. They went to African countries. They even played in places like they played in Nigeria. They played in East Africa, and often they played a lot in South Africa, because South Africa was this like new country. It was free. The infrastructure was great, so they go down there and play games against Kaizer Chiefs and all the Pirates. So Liverpool did the same thing. Actually, by the way, talk about Mandela. That's where all these photos that you see of Mandela hanging out with like David Beckham or with whoever, like Italian footballers, French, Zidane. I went to a game. France played South Africa in it was called the Nelson Mandela Cup. They usually played it on Independence Day, around like the South African version of Independence Day. They call it Freedom Day, on the 27th of April. And this game was played in Joburg. Zidane was there. The famous team of '98 came to play in that game. But not to make a long story short, Liverpool went 95. And again, I'll drop something. I also went to one of those games. They played in Cape Town. That's when John Barnes. They played at Newlands Cricket Ground. And during that tour, the story was being spread that Nelson Mandela was actually a Liverpool fan. Now, people knew that he was a fan of Orlando Pirates, which is a local South African football club from Johannesburg. And he had apparently told Liverpool's visiting tour party that while he was on Robben Island, Tony is totally loving and enjoying this, that he had been a Liverpool fan. I was like, I did think it was weird because knowing what Liverpool was like in the 1970s, as a club with very few, or I don't think any black players. I think their first black player was in the early 1980s with what is his name? He's from Liverpool.
Not Gale.
Howard Gale.
Yeah.
Howard Gale, right? And later, of course, John Barnes, and but very slowly. So it was a surprise to hear that Mandela was this fan of Liverpool. But in any case, this story grew legs because then Razor Radok, who was kind of infamous for partying hard and played for Liverpool at that time. He was like a sort of midfielder, defensive midfielder. Or was he a defender? Central defender. I can't even remember clearly anymore. He's repeated the story multiple times that after the first game, which was against Kaizer Chiefs, and then in Joburg, and the second game in Cape Town was against Cape Town Spurs, which is an interesting Cape Town team. But after the Joburg game, they ended up at Mandela's house, he said, and Mandela took out the castles and drank Castle Lager, yeah, and drank with them. And then Mandela came back for the second night, and this is the proof that he's a Liverpool supporter, to party with them again. To this, Tony says what?
Tony says, I will give you 2 bits of information, one of which says this could be true. The other one says, no, he's having a laugh. Which one do you want first?
Having a laugh. I think.
Okay, so the one that tells you he's having a laugh is the one that says, remember what Nelson Mandela said, and I will quote him word for word, the day that he met the Spice Girls. And I quote, "This is the greatest day of my life." Nelson Mandela just, he was a gracious host of all these people who wanted to come and see him and hang out and made them feel good. He made them feel important, but it was completely, he never meant any of it.
Yeah. Drake wears every team's jersey and tells every team he's their greatest supporter.
Exactly. So there's that. On the other hand, I don't agree with you about the island, because on the island, so one fantastic story I know about Mandela was when he came out, he had like a protocol officer who would give him a briefing, just one talking point for every like European celebrity who would come to visit, who would want some time with him, like the Liverpool football players or whatever. Just give him one talking point to have a conversation. So the day that Mandela is going to meet David Bowie, right, the protocol officer comes to him and says, well, the interesting thing about David Bowie is that he has one brown eye and one green eye. Mandela looks at him and says, it's David Bowie, ground control to Major Tom. Now, Mandela, when that song is out, is on Robben Island, right? They used to get LPs, like vinyl LPs, and some guys from MK used to DJ. And, he had this awareness of things that were out there in the world. Now, it would be breaking ranks with the SACP, of course, which, he was a candidate member of. But because most of them were Arsenal supporters, except for Joe Slovo, who weirdly was a Chelsea supporter. But that said, so it wouldn't be out of the question
given the obsession with English football in South Africa, it's not far-fetched that he was
and also if that had been something that happened in the mid-1970s, it's not like any other English clubs at that point had any black players. It would have been the first black players that started emerging in English first division football, as a group, are the Viv Anderson, Laurie Cunningham, Mark Chamberlain, Cyril Regis at West Brom. That's like 77 or so.
Somebody was going to correct us. Leeds in the 1960s played a few South Africans, I think at least 2 or 3. Terry Francis, and of course, famously, Albert Johannesson, who was the first black player to play in an FA Cup final, right, for Leeds. So there again, the story of like South Africa. So there is something. It might be true that Mandela was a Liverpool.
It wouldn't surprise me.
I read about English football. They followed it religiously, more than they followed other football. I mean, I'm currently looking at the story of a South African footballer born in Johannesburg. His name was David Julius, who then played in. So there were these mixed kind of multiracial leagues in Lourenço Marques, colonial Mozambique, where the Portuguese teams would come to play in South Africa and in Mozambique, on tour, like Sporting, the other Benfica. So they saw him play and liked him, and they asked, they were like, you should come to Portugal. So then he goes to Portugal, where he ends up playing for Sporting. I'm trying to remember the number, but like more than almost 200 games. I mean, I'm gonna try and write something about this guy. And then he changes his name. Yeah, we're about to close now. He changes his name to David Julio. So he kind of makes Julio. I can't say the Portuguese style to make it Portuguese. He plays for Portugal. And he actually wins a European. I think it was like the Super Cup. He wins like a European. So he, long before Benny McCarthy, he becomes like the first South African to win a European championship. But nobody cared.
Yeah, because I mean, Eusebio was from Mozambique. Yeah. It was not unusual to have African players start.
But even Eusebio, I don't think in many parts of English-speaking Africa until the World Cup, which is this. We will get into this another time. Before television, I think. Before like the way the internet's, before cable and package, before packages, those kind of weekly packages, then it was like, cable television, satellite TV, the internet. Before that, if you learned about a footballer, and Simon Cooper writes about this, about Johan Cruyff, you only saw them at the World Cup. If you grew up in, like I think he said, if you grew up in France, a part of France, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, you knew about how great Johan Cruyff was at Ajax, and then again with some parts of France and Spain, you knew how good he was at Barcelona, and if other than that, you only saw him at the World Cup. So I think Eusebio, a lot of people never saw Eusebio except with film reel or the beginnings of television because a couple of African countries started getting TV in the mid-60s. South Africa, of course, we know they only get it in 76. But I think that's where following something that is more like in the popular mind because of colonialism and the newspapers, which in South Africa, they looked to England. So to make a long story short, I go with your second thesis that maybe Mandela was a fan of Liverpool. We always got to end with that. We always got to give it to Liverpool.
Yeah. And at some point, yes, one of our future episodes, we need to talk about how back in that moment when you're talking about Brazil was the proxy for the whole global South. Whether you were in India, whether you were in South Africa, whether you were anywhere else in Africa, whether you were black in Britain. I mean, Gary Young writes about that. Like when Black Britain embraces
Brazil. It might be useful for us to go, and I wouldn't mind watching the Pele documentary on Netflix and coming to talk about that in Brazil. Brazil is this kind of like the idea of Brazil. That might be.
Remember Bob Marley's wearing Brazil shirts.
Let's not give all the secrets away. Let's do a Brazil. We can do a little Brazil. We can do a Brazil episode.
All right, excellent.
We should find something for a Brazil episode. Anyway, this was great. The show is on YouTube for the rest of the time. You can watch it whenever you want during the week. Until the next week Thursday we'll be back again. It's also now on Facebook, and as you saw from tonight onwards, we started introducing clips. So we're trying to get a little bit more sophisticated. In any case, see you next week. Bye.